Welcome to my channel. Subscribe and enjoy my new stories every day. When I first met Emma, she was everything I thought I wanted. Charming, witty, and with a magnetic personality that seemed to pull people toward her. She was the type of woman who could change the energy in a room simply by walking into it. People liked her instantly, and so did I. She knew how to make people feel special, like they were the only ones who mattered in that moment. That's how she made me feel when we started dating. I was the center of her world, or so I believed. Our life together felt like a puzzle where each piece clicked perfectly. I was a successful marketing consultant with clients across various industries, and she managed our household with an effortless grace. 2 beautiful kids, a cozy home in the suburbs, friends who came over for barbecues in the summer, everything felt exactly how I'd hoped marriage would be. We were both in our early 30s, young enough to still feel the thrill of building something together but mature enough to appreciate how hard it was to get there. For 12 years, I never once doubted her, never felt the need to question her love or loyalty. Emma was my partner, my best friend, and, I thought, my rock. But that Friday morning shattered the illusion. She stood there, her back to the kitchen counter, sipping coffee as if she had all the time in the world. It was only after I asked her what her plans were for the day that she dropped it on me. "I'll be going out tonight," she said, her tone infuriatingly casual, "and I might not be back until tomorrow morning." At first, I thought she was joking. This was Emma, my wife, the woman who'd made it a point to come home in time for family dinners, who organized every little detail of our lives with meticulous care. The idea of her spending a night out, not returning until morning, was absurd. I tried to laugh it off, but something in her gaze told me she wasn't kidding. "What's the occasion?" I asked, hoping she'd tell me she was just messing with me. But she didn't. "I've been thinking," she began, and the way she said it made my stomach turn. It was rehearsed, as though she'd been preparing for this conversation for a while. "You know, I feel like I missed out on some things. Life is short. People aren't meant to be monogamous." I was speechless. I wanted to ask her if she'd fallen down some YouTube rabbit hole of pop psychology videos. Instead, I just stared at her, wondering if I'd misheard. But Emma didn't stop there. She launched into a monologue about self-discovery, how she needed, this time, to explore other facets of herself, and how it would ultimately make her happier in our marriage. The word happier grated against me, as though she'd been quietly miserable all these years and I'd been too clueless to notice. "Wait," I said finally, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You're telling me you want to spend the night out, alone?" She hesitated for just a second, her polished demeanor cracking ever so slightly. "Yes," she said. "It's not about you, John. It's about me. I need this time." There were 100 questions bubbling inside me, but somehow I managed to hold them back. Every instinct screamed at me to demand answers, to beg her to explain what had gone wrong. But instead, I found myself staring down at the coffee mug in my hands, swirling its contents like I was trying to read tea leaves. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was Emma, my Emma, and she was talking like someone I didn't recognize. The rest of the day passed in a fog. I kept hoping she'd call, text, tell me she'd changed her mind. But when I got home that evening, the house was empty. She'd taken the kids to her sister's for the weekend, so I wouldn't have to look them in the eyes while my world quietly crumbled. It was almost considerate, if it hadn't been so cold. I wandered around the house, touching things, trying to ground myself in the familiar, but everything felt wrong. This place, our home, was supposed to be my safe haven. Now it felt like a museum, filled with artifacts of a life that no longer existed. I thought about calling her, but I didn't. Instead, I sat down on the couch, stared at the silent TV, and tried to wrap my head around what was happening. At midnight, she still hadn't returned. My anger simmered as I realized she really was following through with her plan. There was no remorse, no concern for what this would do to me or our family. It was as if she'd decided her needs were the only ones that mattered. The next morning, she walked in as casually as she'd left, carrying a bag from some upscale bakery. She placed it on the counter like she'd been out on a harmless morning run. Her eyes sparkled with that practiced ease, the same effortless charm she wore in social gatherings, the one that used to be for me alone. I'd seen her use it to win over friends, charm my colleagues, and now, apparently, to soothe her own guilt. I couldn't hold back anymore. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Her face remained impassive, unbothered. "Out," she replied. She wasn't apologizing, wasn't even trying to lie about it. She'd embraced this new narrative completely. I tried to find the words to ask why, to force some kind of remorse out of her, but I knew it wouldn't matter. She'd already crossed the line. "I'm done," I whispered, half to myself, half to her, but she caught it. "Done?" she asked, raising an eyebrow as if I'd just suggested we cancel dinner plans. "Yes," I replied, louder this time. "I'm done. I'll give you all the space you need, Emma. You're free to do whatever you want." The words came out colder than I intended, but I meant every syllable. She shrugged, unfazed. "I thought you'd understand." It was that last line that sealed it for me. Emma was lost in her script, her role as the enlightened spouse who had finally embraced her true self. She expected me to play along, to nod and let her do whatever she wanted, all under the guise of love. That night, as she drifted off, I sat in the darkened living room, formulating my next move. Emma wanted freedom, and I would give it to her, completely and without reserve. But it would be on my terms, not hers. The silence after her words echoed louder than I could have imagined. Emma was sure of herself, as if she'd scripted and polished every word for maximum effect. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just watched a performance. The idea of my wife, the woman I trusted more than anyone, living out some rehearsed narrative was surreal. But beneath the anger and betrayal, a dark calm settled in. If she wanted to play a part, I'd cast myself as the lead in her story. The first few days after her announcement were quiet. She went through her routine, cheerful and detached, leaving for work each morning with a lightness that only highlighted the weight I felt. I kept to my schedule as well, deliberately avoiding confrontation, silently absorbing her hints that this new perspective was bringing us closer. After the kids went to bed one night, Emma brought it up again. She leaned over the kitchen counter, eyeing me as though assessing my reaction. "You know, John," she began, swirling her wine glass, "this freedom, it's refreshing. I think it's making us stronger." Her words hung in the air like a dare, and I held her gaze, unwilling to give her the reaction she sought. "You're probably right," I replied calmly. "A bit of change never hurt anyone." I watched her blink, surprised by my response. I could tell she expected anger, maybe even jealousy. But I wasn't about to hand her any ammunition. She nodded slowly, seeming almost satisfied, and gave me one of those bright, practiced smiles that had once been just for me. That night, I got to work. If Emma wanted this new phase to rewrite our relationship, I'd need to rewrite my own role. There was no question in my mind that her outings weren't innocent. I just didn't know the extent of her betrayal yet, but I was determined to find out. The next morning, I told her I was taking on some new clients and would be working late. "You've inspired me," I said, matching her earlier tone, "to try something new." She raised an eyebrow, curious. "That's great," she replied, her smile almost condescending. She probably thought I was trying to compete, to show her that I could do whatever she was doing, even if I didn't fully understand it. "Change is good for everyone," she said, as if giving me permission. That evening, I stayed at the office, poring over everything I could find in her social media and phone logs. I knew her habits well, she wouldn't be careless with any obvious texts or calls. Instead, she kept things discreet. But I knew Emma well enough to find her patterns. She'd leave the house an hour early some mornings or come home just a bit later than expected. Subtle changes, but over time, they added up. Through a little careful searching, I managed to find a few connections. The same guy from her yoga class appeared in her friend circles online. Photos at a coffee shop, captions that seemed friendly on the surface but hinted at a familiarity that struck me as odd. A few more digs, and I found his profile. Name, Aiden. Divorced, athletic, with a penchant for New Age philosophy and wellness. The more I scrolled, the more this yoga friend seemed like the exact type of discovery Emma thought she needed. The next few days, I continued watching her patterns, staying patient, quiet, and calm. Every time I felt a surge of anger, I forced myself to breathe, reminding myself that anger wouldn't help me. I had to be strategic. I made a habit of leaving the house just after her, sometimes staying at work late, sometimes taking my laptop to a nearby cafe and watching as she reinvented herself. She barely noticed my own absence, seemingly too wrapped up in her own plans. My first real confirmation came one Saturday morning. Emma had taken the kids to her sister's for the weekend, giving her the perfect excuse to stay out. I followed her, carefully keeping my distance as she drove to the neighboring town, parking at an upscale cafe that sat just on the edge of a hiking trail. I watched from across the street as she stepped out, dressed in her yoga gear and carrying a mat. And then he arrived, Aiden. They exchanged a quick hug before heading into the cafe together. I stayed in my car, fingers tapping the steering wheel, watching as they ordered their coffees and settled into a corner table, deep in conversation. For nearly 2 hours, I waited, fighting every urge to confront them right then and there. But I knew I'd need more. Confronting her now wouldn't change a thing, and I'd just be the husband who overreacted. When they finally left, Emma drove back to her sister's, where she collected the kids and returned home, cheerful and chatty, as though she hadn't spent her morning with another man. I kept quiet, letting her bask in her little secret, knowing that my silence would make her feel invincible. Over the next few weeks, I began implementing my plan. The first step was to increase her comfort level. I made sure I was understanding, even feigning interest in her newfound freedom. Every time she hinted that this was just one of those phases, I played along, listening like the doting husband who respected her exploration. She grew bolder, more reckless, and I began noticing other changes, calls to new numbers, longer work hours, even an increase in her shopping habits. In the meantime, I started reaching out to a lawyer. I wanted this planned perfectly, there'd be no slip-ups, no oversight on my part. If Emma was rewriting her life, I'd rewrite mine. Quietly, I made lists, gathered bank statements, credit card transactions, and emails. I knew she had a separate account from her parents' inheritance, and although I'd never had access to it, I suspected she was dipping into it more frequently. As I moved forward with my plan, she continued living in her bubble. Emma threw herself into this new, open phase, without a second thought, fully convinced that I was buying every word of her speeches about self-discovery. I knew she had no clue what I was up to, no idea that I was building a case against her, planning an exit that would leave her reeling. Finally, after a month of this charade, everything was in place. All that was left was to let her keep digging her own grave, giving her just enough rope to believe she was in control. Emma wanted freedom, and I would give it to her, but on my terms. She didn't see it coming. Each night, as I silently reviewed every piece of evidence I'd gathered, I could feel the calm solidifying within me. Emma had turned our marriage into a performance, one where she got to play the lead, the enlightened spouse, breaking free. But she'd never anticipated that I'd turn her script on its head. The next act would be mine alone. I watched Emma embrace her new phase with a fervor that would have been admirable if it weren't so devastating. She floated through the house in a perpetual state of bliss, her eyes always somewhere distant, as though the person she was with and the life she was leading wasn't enough. She had a renewed confidence, almost giddy with the thought that I was letting her grow, as she liked to put it. I watched her carefully each day, keeping a calm mask in place as she lived her double life with increasing brazenness. Her latest story was about how she was going on a self-care retreat with a friend she claimed to have met in one of her yoga classes. It was only for the weekend, she said, a casual few days away to recharge and recenter. I barely reacted, knowing that the friend wasn't a friend at all but Aiden, the very same guy I'd followed to that cafe. I let her tell her story, nodding along as if I were buying every word. But I'd long since stopped taking anything she said at face value. I was nearly ready for the next phase of my plan. All I needed was for her to play her part one last time. The day before her so-called retreat, I made sure everything was ready. I'd arranged to have the kids stay at my parents' for the weekend and lined up my meeting with the lawyer to finalize our divorce paperwork. All that was left was to ensure that Emma believed she was completely in control. That morning, I dropped a few casual hints that would nudge her into trusting me even more. "Have a great time," I said, handing her a packed lunch before she left for work. "Everyone needs a break now and then." She smiled, seeming genuinely touched, as though I were finally coming around to her way of thinking. "Thank you for being so understanding, John," she said softly, squeezing my hand. "I know this has been a lot." Inside, I was screaming, but I forced a smile. "Of course. I just want you to be happy, Em." The day passed in a blur as I readied myself, organizing every document I'd gathered over the last few weeks. Bank statements, phone logs, and photographs were all cataloged neatly in a binder. I didn't plan to use them unless I had to. I was hoping she'd agree to a clean break once the truth finally came out. But I knew her well enough to prepare for any reaction. When she left that Friday evening for her retreat, I watched her drive away, a strange calm settling over me. The anger I'd felt in the beginning had long since faded. What was left now was a cold sense of purpose, a determination to reclaim my life from the woman who had betrayed me so effortlessly. As her car disappeared around the corner, I locked the front door behind me and went to my study, pulling out the last document I'd been saving. It was our final bank statement, one showing a few $1,000s missing from our joint account, funds she had transferred, without my knowledge, into her inheritance account. This, coupled with the other expenses she'd made, was more than enough to file for an at-fault divorce. I spent the rest of the evening going through the final details, ensuring everything was in place for the inevitable confrontation. As I looked around our home, I realized how strange it felt to think of it as ours any longer. Emma had abandoned it in all but name, and now it was simply the place where she'd lived out her fantasy while pretending to still be my wife. The next morning, I met with my lawyer. He was sharp, efficient, and, more importantly, sympathetic to my situation. We went over each piece of evidence, the documented expenses, the records of her retreats, and the incriminating photos. "You're in a strong position, John," he said, tapping the stack of documents. "With everything you have here, she'll have little room to negotiate." I nodded, feeling a strange satisfaction settle over me. I didn't want revenge, exactly, but I wanted Emma to feel the weight of what she'd done. She'd shattered our lives, and it was time she faced the consequences. I signed the last of the paperwork, leaving it in my lawyer's capable hands, and headed home to wait for her return. She came back on Sunday evening, looking more radiant than ever, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright. I watched her as she set down her bags, noticing how she barely glanced at me before heading straight to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of wine. She didn't even ask where the kids were, she seemed far too lost in her own world to care. When she finally sat down across from me at the kitchen table, I decided it was time. "Did you have a nice weekend?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. She looked up, surprised at my question, then smiled. "Yes, it was amazing. Exactly what I needed." She took a sip of her wine, swirling it in her glass. "I feel like a new person." I nodded, letting her bask in her illusion a little longer. "I'm glad you enjoyed it, Emma. Really, I am." There was a pause, and I could see the unease creep into her expression as she registered the tone in my voice. "John, is everything okay?" "Oh, everything's fine," I said, folding my hands on the table. "But I think it's time we had a talk." She froze, setting her glass down carefully, as if bracing herself for what was to come. "What kind of talk?" I took a breath, feeling the weight of all the months of betrayal, the nights spent wondering what went wrong, and the agony of watching her lie to my face. But now, there was only clarity. "Emma," I said, my voice calm, "I know about Aiden." The color drained from her face. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to process my words. "Aiden," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes, Aiden," I replied, my tone hardening. "The guy you've been spending your weekends with. The one you've been seeing behind my back while feeding me lies about needing space and self-discovery." She looked away, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. "John." Her voice broke, and for the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. "I didn't mean for it to be like this." I shook my head, feeling a cold satisfaction settle over me. "Of course, you didn't. None of you ever do." She finally met my gaze, her eyes wide and pleading. "John, please. I know I made mistakes, but we can work this out. I love you, I swear." Her words sounded hollow, empty. I had no doubt that she believed them in some twisted way, but they meant nothing to me now. I stood up, pushing my chair back, and looked down at her with the clarity I'd been waiting for. "No, Emma. You don't love me. You love the idea of me, of having someone to fall back on while you live out your little fantasies. But that's over. I'm done." Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, trying to grab my hand, but I pulled away. "Please, John," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't do this. I'll stop, I promise. I'll make it right." I watched her for a moment, feeling a strange mix of pity and anger. "It's too late for that, Emma," I replied. "I've already spoken with a lawyer. The divorce papers will be ready tomorrow." She broke down then, sobbing as she begged me to reconsider, promising to be the wife she should have been all along. But I knew better. I'd seen her deception firsthand, felt the sting of her betrayal, and now, all that was left was a deep resolve to move forward without her. As I walked out of the room, her cries echoing in my ears, I felt a strange calm settle over me. She had wanted freedom, and I had given it to her, only now, she would face it alone. As I left the kitchen, her sobs grew quieter, muffled as if by distance, though I was only one room away. I could still feel her desperate grip on my arm, her cold fingers trying to hold on to something that no longer existed. It was over. Or at least, I thought it was. That night, I slept in the guest bedroom, ignoring her occasional knocks on the door, her pleas through the keyhole, the whispered apologies that felt as empty as everything else that had come before them. For the first time in months, I managed to sleep without the gnawing ache in my chest, the anxiety of knowing my marriage was slowly falling apart. It was a strange, heavy calm. The morning light broke through the thin blinds, casting sharp shadows across the room, reminding me of all the days that lay ahead, the ones I would be facing alone. I gathered the rest of my belongings in silence, ready to move on with my life as soon as I could. By the time I headed downstairs, Emma was gone, her absence creating a strange hollowness in the house. It was a relief, but an eerie one. That morning, I drove to the lawyer's office to finalize the paperwork. The signing was quick and impersonal. Just a few signatures, a stack of documents to read over, and the usual formalities. In less than half an hour, I had a folder in my hands that officially marked the end of a life I'd spent years building. I should have felt something, relief, satisfaction, perhaps even freedom, but instead, a weight settled in, something I couldn't quite shake. It was done, but it didn't feel real. Not yet. As I left the office, my phone buzzed with a message from Emma. I didn't want to read it, didn't want to deal with whatever she might have to say, but some instinct told me I needed to know. I'm sorry, John. I know I ruined everything. I never meant for it to be like this. Please meet me tonight. Just one last time. At the cafe where we had our first date. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the message. A dozen reasons not to go flashed through my mind. But curiosity, or maybe some lingering sense of duty, got the better of me. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. She would know that I'd come. By the time evening rolled around, I was standing outside the cafe, hands stuffed in my pockets, watching the world go by through the windows. The same old place, untouched by time, buzzing with the same chatter and low jazz music it had the night we met. I stepped inside, scanning the room until I saw her sitting in the corner, her hands wrapped around a mug, staring out the window. As I approached, she looked up, her eyes swollen from crying, her expression raw in a way I hadn't seen before. She was quieter now, a shadow of the woman who had been so confident and so certain in her decisions just days ago. John, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. Thank you for coming. I didn't respond, sitting down across from her in silence, unsure of what to say or even how to feel. I could see that she was struggling to find words, to piece together some explanation that could make sense of everything she'd done. I want you to know, she started, her voice shaking, that none of it was about you. I don't even know why I did it. I was trying to find something, trying to feel something. But I don't know what it was. I nodded, keeping my face neutral. I'd heard versions of this story before, rehearsed in different ways. And yet, something in her voice made me hesitate. She was speaking from a depth I hadn't expected, as if whatever she'd discovered had torn her apart as much as it had me. She took a shaky breath, staring down at her coffee. John, I was diagnosed with something. A condition. They call it early onset dementia. Her voice cracked, the words like a thunderclap. I've known for a while now. That's why I started acting out. I couldn't face it. I didn't want to accept it. The room seemed to spin around me, the world narrowing down to the woman sitting across from me, her words echoing in my mind like a hammer. Dementia. The word seemed impossible, absurd, like some cruel twist of fate. Emma looked up, her eyes filled with an anguish I couldn't comprehend. I was scared, John. I thought, maybe if I did something reckless, I could convince myself I was still me, still alive. But I've just been falling apart, and I didn't know how to tell you. I was hoping you'd see through it, that you'd know me better than I knew myself. But I guess I pushed you too far. My mind reeled, struggling to process what she was saying, to reconcile this revelation with everything I'd thought I knew. My anger, my hurt, all the plans I'd laid out, suddenly they seemed petty, meaningless. I'd been so focused on protecting myself, on building a case against her, that I hadn't seen the person underneath, the woman who had been drowning right in front of me. She reached across the table, her hand shaking as she held mine. I know I ruined us. I know there's no coming back from this. But I didn't want to leave things like this. I didn't pull my hand away. Instead, I held it tightly, feeling the weight of everything we'd been through, all the pain and love and anger and regret binding us together. Emma, I murmured, barely able to keep my voice steady. Why didn't you tell me? Her eyes filled with fresh tears as she shook her head. I didn't want you to feel trapped. I didn't want you to see me like this, to watch me fade away. I thought it would be easier if you hated me. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, each lost in our own thoughts, our own memories of a life that felt like it had happened to other people. I remembered all the good times, the laughter, the quiet moments of contentment, the times she'd been my rock when life seemed impossible. And now, all that was left was the knowledge that we'd been broken by something far greater than either of us could have ever controlled. When we finally stood to leave, she hugged me, and it felt like a goodbye that neither of us would ever truly come back from. I watched her walk away, her figure blending into the darkening street, until she was just another shadow under the streetlights. That night, I sat alone in the empty house, feeling the full weight of what we'd both lost. In the end, Emma had taken everything from me, not out of selfishness or betrayal, but out of a terror too profound to confront. She'd left me to face a future I hadn't prepared for, one that would be defined by the haunting knowledge of what might have been if only I'd seen her for who she truly was. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on, but the world felt different, hollow, as though I were navigating someone else's life. Every room in our house held a memory, a piece of her that would never fade. I went through the motions, resumed my work, saw the kids on weekends, but nothing felt real. One evening, just as I was about to lock up for the night, the phone rang. It was a nurse from the memory care facility Emma had checked herself into a few days after our last meeting. She had deteriorated rapidly, the nurse said. They weren't sure how much time she had left. I drove to the facility in a daze, the world around me blurring as I replayed every memory of her, every moment I'd taken for granted. When I reached her room, she was staring out the window, lost in a place I couldn't reach. She didn't recognize me, her eyes vacant, her expression blank. But I sat with her, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of awareness, hoping that somewhere, deep inside, she could feel that I was there. And in that quiet room, surrounded by the fading echoes of our life together, I whispered the words I hadn't had the courage to say before. I forgive you, Emma.